Close your eyes and imagine a world before kings, before empires, before the whisper of written words. The air is thick with smoke from the hearths of 1,000 small fires. Across the valleys of the Near East, people strike stone against stone until sparks leap like living stars. For thousands of years, these sparks were the only flames humanity could control. Something brighter emerged. Somewhere between 3,300 and 1200 BCE, a transformation began. A glimmer deep in the mountains, hidden in veins of ore, changed the course of human history forever. Bronze, it was not found, it was made. A fusion of copper and tin, born through patience, experimentation, and an alchemy no one fully understood. And as metal met flame, civilization itself was reforged. You can almost hear the hiss of molten metal pouring into a clay mold. The first clang of a bronze axe striking against stone, the echo of human ingenuity awakening. Villages turned into cities, and people began to shape the world around them with a confidence that was both thrilling and dangerous. Farmers became artisans, artisans became traders, and traders became kings. From the dusty plains of Mesopotamia to the shores of the Mediterranean, the world hummed with the sound of progress, the rhythmic beating of hammers, the chant of priests, the quiet ambition of those who believed they could command both nature and destiny. But progress has a shadow. For every tool, there was a weapon. For every wall raised, a neighbor watched in envy. The Bronze Age was not just an era of creation, it was the birth of rivalry, of empire, of war. In its shimmering surface, humanity saw both its greatness and its greed. Sit back, relax, and let the firelight of this forgotten age flicker across your imagination. Because tonight, we travel into the very heart of early civilization, to a time when gods were made of gold. Kings ruled through fear, and the world's first great stories were written not on paper, but in bronze. From one mystery to the next, this is the world as it was before history began to fade into legend. And it all started with a spark that refused to die, as the bronze tools clinked and glowed in the hands of their makers. The quiet hum of human life grew into something larger, something organized, deliberate, and unstoppable. The first cities rose not from conquest, but from the rhythm of routine, the sowing of crops, the shaping of clay, the counting of grain. It began in Mesopotamia, between the twin rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates, where silt-rich soil gave birth to abundance. People gathered here for water, for trade, for protection, and slowly, out of the mud and the reeds, they built Uruk. Imagine walking through its streets, narrow alleys lined with mud brick walls, markets echoing with the call of merchants, the smell of fresh bread and burning incense mixing in the warm air. At the city's heart stood ziggurats, massive tiered temples that scraped the sky, their tops veiled in mist and myth. Each step upward brought one closer to the gods, or perhaps to power itself. Bronze chisels cut the stones, bronze blades harvested the fields that fed the builders, and bronze jewelry shimmered around the wrists of priests and queens. Everything gleamed in that new metal's light. But beneath that brilliance lay an intricate web of hierarchy and control. The first kings ruled not just with armies but with symbols, with seals pressed into wet clay, recording the flow of goods, the debts owed, the prayers offered. For the first time, memory itself was preserved. The invention of writing, cuneiform, carved the thoughts of humankind into permanence. No longer would stories vanish with their tellers now, the clay remembered. Yet with permanence came pride. And pride, as history whispers, is the prelude to conflict. Uruk's neighbors watched its walls rise higher and its influence spread wider. Trade turned into rivalry, alliances into suspicion. The same bronze that built the city also forged its weapons. Spears, daggers, and chariot fittings. Beautiful, lethal, irresistible. Civilization had awakened, but it was restless. The rivers that nourished life could flood and destroy it just as easily, reminding everyone how fragile their triumphs truly were. The city was a miracle, but it was also a warning. From the glow of its fires to the shadows beneath its temples, the world was learning that power, once shaped, could never truly be contained. And beyond those walls, other lands were watching, waiting, and learning how to shape their own. In the cradle of Mesopotamia, under the blistering sun and beside the restless rivers, power became sacred. The Sumerians believed their rulers were not merely men, but intermediaries chosen by the gods to bring order to a chaotic world. Each city had its divine patron, each temple its gate to the heavens. Life revolved around faith and fear, harvest and hope. The kings were both servants and masters of these divine forces. Picture the temple of Uruk rising like a mountain of baked clay, its steps echoing with the chants of priests as incense curls into the air. Bronze lamps flicker inside dark chambers, casting light on walls covered in carvings of winged deities and horned crowns. Statues of worshippers, eyes wide in eternal devotion, stare forward as if waiting for a god who might yet return. The Sumerians built their gods from the same clay that built their cities, molded, baked, and immortalized in the material of the earth itself. Their stories told of Enlil, god of the wind, who gave kings the breath of rule, and Inanna, goddess of love and war, whose temper could bless or destroy an entire nation. Every harvest, every flood, every victory or defeat was believed to echo the will of these unseen powers. Yet behind the divine order was a human truth. Power was addictive. Kings like Gilgamesh, part man and part legend, sought not only to serve the gods, but to surpass them. His story etched into clay tablets that survived long after his kingdom fell spoke of pride, mortality, and the eternal hunger to be remembered. It was the first great epic of humankind, a mirror held up to the new civilization that was beginning to understand its own reflection. Around the temples, scribes recorded offerings, merchants tallied accounts, and farmers prayed for rain. The city thrived, and bronze gleamed everywhere, the symbol of man's triumph over the elements. But as the power of the kings grew, so did their distance from the people they ruled. The ziggurats rose higher, but so did the shadows they cast. And in those shadows, whispers began to spread of rival cities, of jealous gods, of empires that would one day challenge Sumer's divine right to rule. For even in an age of gods, the hearts of men remained restless. And far beyond the rivers, other civilizations were stirring, learning to shape the same metal and dreaming of their own immortality. As the Sumerian cities grew proud and divided, a new force emerged from the northern plains, a kingdom that would reshape Mesopotamia and teach the world what it meant to rule not a city, but an empire. His name was Sargon of Akkad, and he began not as a king, but as a servant. Legend says he was set adrift in a basket on the Euphrates as an infant, saved by fate, and raised to command by the will of the gods. Whether myth or truth, Sargon's rise was a storm sudden, unstoppable, and unforgettable. Around 2334 BCE, he united the fractious city-states of Sumer beneath one banner, one army, one dream. The city of Akkad became the heart of this new world, pulsing with trade, tribute, and the relentless hum of ambition. Imagine the streets of Akkad glittering with bronze-armored soldiers, merchants carrying lapis lazuli from distant lands, priests counting offerings beneath golden idols. The Akkadian language replaced Sumerian as the voice of power, and cuneiform tablets multiplied like seeds across the empire. Roads stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, and for the first time in history, a single ruler held sway over diverse peoples, languages, and gods. But the weight of empire is heavy, even for those who forge it. To maintain control, Sargon stationed trusted governors in conquered cities, demanded loyalty oaths, and built networks of spies and messengers. Yet the more he expanded, the more fragile his creation became. The land that gave life could also take it away. Drought, rebellion, and invasion began to gnaw at the edges of his dominion. The same rivers that once fed Akkad turned treacherous, their waters shrinking under a pitiless sun. By the time Sargon's grandsons ruled, the empire trembled. Enemies from the mountains known as the Gushans descended upon the plains like a tide of vengeance. Akkad's once mighty walls fell silent, its streets empty but for ghosts and sand. The world's first empire had risen with brilliance and fallen with equal force, leaving behind ruins and lessons that would echo for centuries. Yet even in its collapse, Akkad left a mark that time could not erase, the idea that power could be forged, not inherited. That men could shape destiny as surely as they shaped bronze. And as the dust settled, others watched and learned, waiting for their turn to rule the world. From the ashes of Akkad rose new cities, stronger, wiser, and determined to last. Among them was Babylon, a modest settlement that would one day rule the world's imagination. By 1792 BCE, a man named Hammurabi ascended its throne, and under his reign, the city became a beacon of order in a chaotic age. Babylon was unlike the older cities of Sumerit, was disciplined, deliberate, and built upon the belief that justice itself could be shaped just like bronze. Imagine walking through its bustling gates, traders from distant lands bartering for grain and gold, scribes pressing symbols into clay, the hum of life thick in the hot air. And there, at the heart of the city, stood the monument that defined Hammurabi's legacy, tall, black, steely of basalt, its surface carved with nearly 300 laws, each one etched with precision and purpose. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, it declared, not as cruelty, but as balance. The gods, Hammurabi claimed, had given him these laws to preserve harmony between the strong and the weak. For the first time, justice was written, visible, and permanent, an idea more enduring than any empire. Picture the steely glinting under torchlight as citizens gathered to read their fates in its shadow. Farmers, merchants, thieves, and nobles alike knew the rules that governed them. The punishments were harsh, but so was the world that demanded them. To cheat, to steal, to harm another without cause, these acts no longer belonged to chaos. They belonged to law, and yet, behind the rigid words lay something more profound, the human attempt to control fate, to make the unpredictable world predictable. Babylon became the center of this philosophy, a city where bronze blades protected stone tablets, and the divine and the mortal were bound by rules of their own making. Its ziggurats reached skyward, its priests charted the stars, and its people believed themselves under the watchful gaze of Marduk, the supreme god who rose above all others. But no law, however just, could hold back time. As the centuries passed, Babylon would see conquerors rise and fall, its temples rebuilt upon the ruins of the old. Still, Hammurabi's voice would echo through them, all a reminder that civilization, once awakened, must constantly fight to balance power with purpose. And somewhere beyond Babylon's walls, new kingdoms were stirring, ready to inherit both its wisdom and its flaws. Far to the northwest of Babylon, where the mountains of Anatolia rise like jagged waves frozen in stone, another civilization was forging its destiny, not in the fertile valleys of rivers, but in the cold heart of the highlands. They were the Hittites, a people who would master the secrets of both diplomacy and destruction. Their world was one of iron and fire, though the age of bronze still ruled. In the ancient city of Hattusa, smoke curled from furnaces that burned hotter than any before them, and within those flames, weapons were born that shimmered with power. The Hittites were not the first to smelt metal, but they were the first to understand what it meant to wield it strategically, to use metallurgy not only as craft, but as empire. Their kings were both warriors and scholars, their armies disciplined, their spies patient, their scribes meticulous. They kept tablets, thousands of them recording treaties, rituals, and laws in the cuneiform of their Mesopotamian neighbors, yet twisted into their own tongue. Among them lay one of the earliest peace treaties in history, a fragile pact between the Hittite king and the mighty Ramses II of Egypt, signed not in friendship, but in weary respect. Imagine the scene, two ancient powers meeting across the sands of Syria, their chariots gleaming, their banners fluttering, both knowing the cost of endless war. The treaty was inscribed in clay, sent across deserts by royal messengers, and sealed by the gods themselves. But behind this civility burned ambition. The Hittites' capital, Hattusa, was both fortress and labyrinth, gates carved with lions, its walls thick enough to stop legions. Within, priests whispered prayers to Tarhund, the storm god, while generals plotted the next campaign. Bronze swords clashed in the training yards, the sound sharp and rhythmic, like the heartbeat of a civilization ready to conquer. And yet, as with all empires, their strength carried the seed of their undoing. The land was hard, the winters cruel, and the alliances fragile. When the mysterious sea peoples came crashing down upon the eastern Mediterranean, the Hittite kingdom, once the master of the highlands, was consumed in fire and silence. Hattusa fell, its walls blackened, its records buried under ash. But the knowledge they forge, the art of metal, the craft of law, and the idea that kings could be bound by oaths would echo long after their stones had cooled. And beyond those ashes, Egypt stood waiting, both ally and rival, its golden age burning bright beneath the desert sun, beneath the unending glare of the Egyptian sun. Civilization shimmered like a mirage of gold and power. The Nile was its heartbeat, pulsing life through a desert that would have swallowed any lesser people whole. Here, in the Age of Bronze, Egypt was not merely surviving, it was transcending. The pharaohs ruled as gods among men, their thrones carved from both stone and myth. Theirs was a world of dazzling symmetry, temples aligned with the stars, obelisks piercing the sky, statues so immense that they defied time itself. Bronze tools shaped the very image of eternity, chiseling limestone blocks into pyramids, sculpting kings and queens into immortality. In the workshops of Thebes and Memphis, artisans hammered delicate mirrors, blades, and ornaments from copper and tin, each glowing like the sun god Ro's eternal fire. The clinking of metal echoed through palace corridors, a song of progress and devotion. But beneath the grandeur lay the same struggles that haunted every kingdom: power, rebellion, hunger, and faith. The first intermediate period had taught Egypt that even gods could falter, that even the divine throne could crack. Yet from that chaos rose the Middle Kingdom, an age of rebirth, where art, order, and faith found new balance. Pharaohs like Mentuhotep and Senusret restored the Nile's peace, binding Upper and Lower Egypt once more under the watch of Osiris, Lord of the afterlife. Religion was no longer just about kings, it was about eternity itself. Every field tilled, every stone laid, was a prayer to endure. Then came the second intermediate period, and with it, invaders the Hyksos, foreigners who rode chariots and wielded strange weapons of bronze and innovation. They ruled for generations, their presence a scar and a lesson. But Egypt, like the river that birthed it, could not be conquered forever. Out of the north came Amos-I, who drove them out and forged the new kingdom, the Empire Age. Under the blazing banners of Thutmose, Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, and Ramses, Egypt strode across borders and epochs, its power gilded by bronze and belief. The temples of Karnak and Luxor rose, the valley of the kings filled with tombs whispering eternity. Yet, in their ambition to touch the sun, even the pharaohs forgot one truth that time. Like the desert wind, erodes all things, no matter how divine. And while Egypt shone at its zenith, beyond its borders, new powers began to stir in the shadows, waiting for the moment when the sun would finally set on the Golden Empire, south of the Egyptian frontier, where the river narrowed between cliffs of burning stone. Lay Nubia, land both coveted and underestimated. Here, the Bronze Age took root in the sands of Kush and Kerma, nurtured by trade, ambition, and the relentless will to rival the pharaohs themselves. The Nubians were masters of survival, their cities rising from deserts that others deemed unlivable. Beneath the shadow of Egypt's dominance, they built their own temples, forged their own gods, and smelted bronze in the furnace of independence. Long before the world noticed, copper and tin flowed through Nubia's veins, carried in caravans from deep within Africa's untamed heart. The furnaces of Meru glowed crimson under the night sky, sparks flying like stars as bronze took shape in the hands of skilled artisans. Their weapons gleamed with defiance, their ornaments reflected wealth beyond gold. To the north, the Egyptians called them Tarseti, the land of the bow, for their archers were feared from the delta to the cataracts, silent, swift, and deadly. And yet, between these two lands, there was more than war. There was exchange. Nubian gold adorned the temples of Thebes, Nubian cattle grazed in Egyptian fields, and Nubian soldiers guarded the pharaoh's throne. In time, the borders blurred, the conqueror and the conquered traded places. The Middle Kingdom saw Egypt expand southward, its kings erecting fortresses of stone along the Nile to control the flow of trade and power. But those same fortresses would one day crumble, and from their ruins, Nubia would rise again. By 2300 BCE, the city of Kerma flourished, its palaces painted with scenes of gods and warriors, its people standing tall in their bronze and ivory. Even as Egypt reached its imperial heights, Nubia thrived in its shadow, patient and proud. Its culture absorbed influences from the north, yet remained distinctly its own, a blend of desert mysticism and riverine grace. When Egypt faltered, Nubia advanced, its rulers claiming divine ancestry and its artisans perfecting the craft that symbolized strength, bronze, glowing like the sun they both worshipped. The Nile united them and divided them, carrying not just water, but the weight of two civilizations locked in an eternal dance of dominance and legacy. And while Egypt looked north to the Mediterranean, Nubia gazed south into the uncharted lands of Africa, toward mysteries still hidden in the red earth and silence of the ancient river's cradle. While Mesopotamia perfected its city-states between the Tigris and Euphrates, far to the east another power stirred behind the Zagros mountains. The Elamites, shadowed in mystery, rose in the fertile plains of what is now southwestern Iran. Their kingdom centered in Susa city, as old as the Sumerian myths themselves. Elam was no mere frontier. It was the gatekeeper between Mesopotamia and the unknown lands beyond. From their mountains, they watched the Sumerians with wary eyes, their warriors hardened by the stone valleys of Onsh, their artisans crafting bronze weapons and vessels that rivaled those of the great cities of Ur and Lagash. In Elam, kings ruled not with divine right, but through lineage and bloodlines fiercely guarded, and their scribes inscribed their own scripts, distinct from cuneiform, yet echoing its cadence of power. They were both enemies and imitators of Sumer, borrowing the art of writing and metalwork, but twisting it into their own form. Their bronze was darker, their idols stranger, their temples steeped in rites that Mesopotamian priests called unholy. Yet, in truth, it was Elam that often triumphed where others fell. When Akkad rose under Sargon the Great and swept across Mesopotamia, Elam resisted with the patience of a mountain storm. When the empire crumbled, Elam struck back, plundering cities and carrying off idols of gods that once ruled the plains. This cycle of conquest and retaliation would define their history, centuries of vengeance written in bronze and blood. By 2000 BCE, Elam had grown from a rival to a dominant power, connecting the world of Mesopotamia to the distant realms of the Indus Valley. Caravans crossed its roads bearing lapis from Afghanistan, tin from Central Asia, and ideas that would shape the dawn of empire. Its kings built ziggurats like those of Sumer, but dedicated them to gods who demanded sacrifice rather than song. Their warriors wore bronze that gleamed red under the sun, their arrows tipped with poisons drawn from desert herbs. The Elamites never sought immortality in the eyes of posterity. They sought endurance in the memory of fear. And so they endured, outlasting dynasties, haunting Mesopotamian chronicles like a recurring shadow. They were not the cradle of civilization, but the iron gate that guarded its eastern edge, reminder that every golden age is born under the watch of something darker, older, and waiting. In the heart of the Mesopotamian plain, where reeds whispered and temples shimmered in the desert haze, a new power began to stir, power unlike the priestly cities of Sumer, a city whose exact ruins still hide beneath the sands, rose under the hand of a man history would call Sargon the Great. His origins were as mysterious as his ambition. Some said he was the son of a priestess, cast into a river in a basket of reeds, spared by fate itself. Others claimed he was chosen by the goddess Ishtar, born not of nobility but of destiny. Whatever truth lies beneath the legend, Sargon built what no man before him had dared, a united Mesopotamia under one crown. He conquered the city-states one by one, dismantling their rival gods and banners, forging them into a single empire ruled from Akkad. His soldiers carried bronze-tipped spears and marched in formations that terrified those who had only known city militias. He appointed governors, established a standing army, and carved trade routes stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. The Akkadian language, rich and rhythmic, replaced Sumerian as the voice of power, and cuneiform tablets recorded his victories with divine exaggeration. To his followers, Sargon was a god's instrument. To his enemies, He was a storm sent to erase their names from clay. Yet even his empire, built on ambition and blood, was not eternal. The very unity he forged sowed the seeds of rebellion. Distant governors grew proud, old cities whispered of freedom, and the gods of Sumer, once banished, returned in the prayers of the oppressed. Then came drought. The rivers shrank, the fields cracked, and the winds carried dust instead of rain. The Gutians, mountain tribes from the east, swept through the weakened lands, their fury fueled by hunger and chaos. Akkad fell not with a scream, but a sigh, fading into legend. The empire's ruins were swallowed by time, its capital never found. But Sargon's shadow remained. His idea that men could command nations as gods once ruled heavens would haunt every king that followed. In the silence after Akkad's fall, the plains of Sumer waited once again for those who believed they could master the world through bronze, language, and will, when the dust of Akkad settled and its banners were lost to time. The old Sumerian cities stirred again like ancient gods waking from slumber. Among them your rose brightest a city that dared to restore what the empire had broken. Its ziggurat towered above the plain, a stairway to the heavens built for Nana, the moon god, its glazed bricks reflecting the silver of the night sky. The kings of yore, led by Yornamu and later his son Sholgi, declared a new order, the third dynasty of yore. It was not an empire of conquest, but of order, of law, and of divine geometry. Yornamu's code, written in cuneiform centuries before Hammurabi, declared justice as something shaped by human hands rather than left to the whims of priests. Taxes were regulated, trade was organized, and temples once again sang hymns to forgotten gods. Bronze filled the workshops, gold adorned the tombs, and lapis lazuli gleamed from imported treasures that spoke of distant lands. Sholgi, the philosopher king, expanded Yor's reach with both sword and song, boasting of running from Nipper to Yor in a single day, of bringing poets and mathematicians into his court, of teaching his scribes to blend beauty with obedience. But beneath the elegance of law and art, cracks began to spread. The irrigation canals, once symbols of life, began to salt the soil. The rivers that once nourished cities turned sluggish and unpredictable. Distant Amorite tribes, drawn by tales of Sumer's wealth, began crossing the frontiers. The empire of Yor tried to hold them back with walls that stretched for miles, but the desert was patient. One by one, cities fell silent, their temples buried in drifting sands. By 2000 BCE, the last king of Yor Ibisin ruled a city surrounded by famine and ruin. His pleas for help, written on clay tablets, still survive letters to governors who no longer answered, to gods who no longer listened. When Elamite soldiers finally stormed Yor, they carried off its idols and burned its granaries. The ziggurat, once a bridge to heaven, became a monument to despair. Yet even in its fall, Yor left behind the blueprint of civilization itself, its laws, its myths, its vision of humanity as something divine and fragile. As the flames died and silence reclaimed the plain, Sumer's last light faded, but its shadow stretched far beyond its time, whispering to every empire that would rise from its ashes, out of the ruins of Yor, amid the echoes of fallen gods and forgotten kings. A new city began to rise along the Euphrates' city, destined to become a symbol of power, mystery, and human ambition. Babylon began humbly, a small settlement of traders and scribes, its walls modest, its temples barely worthy of the gods' attention. But within its gates burned a hunger that no flood or empire could drown. By the time Hammurabi took the throne, around 1792 BCE, Babylon had transformed from a city of dust into the beating heart of Mesopotamia. Hammurabi understood something few before him had grasped. That power was not just taken by force, it was written, spoken, and believed. He gathered the scattered laws of his ancestors and carved them into black basalt stone for all to see. An eye for an eye, the code declared not just vengeance, but order, hierarchy, control. The code of Hammurabi became more than law. It became scripture, binding merchants, priests, and peasants under the same divine command. Babylon's temples grew taller, its ziggurats reached for the heavens, and its streets pulsed with the murmur of every language between Anatolia and the Gulf. Bronze glimmered in the markets, incense burned in courtyards, and scholars traced the stars, believing the universe itself was a ledger written by the gods. Yet Babylon's greatness was not merely in stone or lit, was in the illusion it created. That man could bring the cosmos into order. Astronomers charted the constellations, priests mapped omens to seasons, and architects built temples so precise they mirrored the heavens. Babylon became a reflection of the universe, a city not of mortals but of meaning. But behind its splendor, shadows gathered. The Amorites who had lifted Babylon were replaced by Kassites, who would rule for centuries, their foreign gods blending into the Babylonian pantheon. Empires rose and fell, yet Babylon endured, feeding on the memory of its own perfection. It became the eternal city of the ancient world, its name synonymous with ambition and sin, wisdom and downfall. Every conqueror from the Hittites to the Assyrians dieted it, not for its riches, but for what it represented, the dream of mastering chaos itself. In Babylon, humanity reached for eternity and touched it only to find that eternity, like the river, could not be held for long. North of Babylon, where the Tigris cuts through hard rock and the winds taste of iron and dust, another people watched and waited. The Assyrians, children of storm and mountain, were once humble herders and traders in the city of Ashur. But as centuries passed, they became something far more, warriors molded by necessity and ambition. They learned that to survive in a world of shifting empires, one must not merely defend but dominate. By the second millennium BCE, their kings spoke of conquest as destiny. Their soldiers carved terror into the earth. Bronze still gleamed on their chariots, but it was iron, their secret weapon, that forged their empire. The Assyrians turned war into an art of precision and spectacle. Their armies marched with disciplined fury, bearing siege towers, battering rams, and the first iron-tipped arrows the world had ever known. When they came, walls crumbled, kings knelt, and cities burned. To their enemies, they were demons. To their own scribes, they were the chosen hand of the god Ashur, sent to bring order through destruction. Their capital cities, Nineveh, and later Nimrod, rose like visions of power incarnate, lined with colossal statues of winged bulls, their faces calm yet merciless. The reliefs carved into their palace walls told stories not of beauty but of domination, kings flaying rebels, lions brought to heel, prisoners paraded beneath the gaze of gods. This was the Assyrian language, fear. Yet behind that terror was genius. They built vast networks of roads and canals, invented systems of administration that allowed them to rule from the Mediterranean to Persia. Their scribes chronicled everything, from omens of eclipses to the weight of tribute carried from conquered lands. Their libraries, especially that of Ashurbanipal, held thousands of tablets, records of conquest, law, myth, and medicine, ensuring that even their brutality was preserved as knowledge. But empires built on fear rot from within. The same roads that carried tribute also carried rebellion. Cities grew weary of endless war, and the gods, once silent, seemed to turn their faces away. When Babylon rose against them, allied with Medes and Chaldeans, the Iron Empire cracked. In 612 BCE, Nineveh fell, its palaces set aflame, its kings lost to legend. The Assyrians vanished almost overnight, leaving behind ruins that whispered of might and madness, of brilliance consumed by its own fire. They had ruled the world through fear and, in the end, became a warning carved in stone far to the northwest, beyond the fertile crescents and the lands of Sumer and Babylon. Another civilization emerged in the rugged heartlands of Anatolia. The Hittites, children of the mountain winds, and the red earth rose quietly, forging their destiny not through divine kingship or temple might, but through mastery of metal and memory. Their capital, Hattusa, stood encircled by massive stone walls, carved lions guarding its gates, and tablets etched with laws older than empires. Theirs was a land of extreme sea winters, dry summers, forests whispering secrets of iron veins buried deep within the hills. And it was here that the Hittites discovered what would change the world forever, the secret of smelting iron, where other nations relied on bronze marriage. Of tin and copper the Hittites learned to tame the raw, stubborn, or that slept beneath their soil. It was difficult, demanding, but it yielded a metal stronger, deadlier, and more enduring. With iron, their weapons cut deeper, their chariots grew faster, and their armies moved like living storms. They became the silent revolutionaries of the ancient world, altering the balance of power without proclaiming it. Their kings ruled not as gods, but as men accountable to law, and their treaties, like the one with Egypt after the bloody Battle of Kadesh, became the first recorded diplomatic accords in human history. Yet for all their progress, the Hittites were haunted by fragility. Their power was built in a land that could not easily feed them. Their empire stretched thin across trade routes and rival clans. When famine came, or enemies pressed in from the sea, their unity faltered. Still, their legacy endured not in monuments, but in methods. They left behind the blueprints of governance, warfare, and metallurgy that would define the next millennium. When Hattusa finally fell around 1200 BCE, consumed by fire and rebellion, it was not the end of their spirit, it was the scattering of their knowledge across continents. Iron spread from Anatolia to every corner of the known world, and the Bronze Age began to fade. The Hittites vanished into myth, remembered only as the people of 1,000 gods. But beneath that title lay something far greater. They were the unseen architects of a new age, the blacksmiths who unknowingly forged the weapon that would end an era, south along the Great Nile, where the desert yields to a green ribbon of life. Another civilization had already begun to master the rhythm of eternity. Egypt, the land of gods and gold, stood apart from the chaos of Mesopotamia and Anatolia. While others rose and fell with war, Egypt endured with ritual, order, and time itself as its foundation. Here, the Bronze Age took on a sacred hue. The shimmer of copper and tin became the color of divinity. Pharaohs ruled as living gods, their word the law of the cosmos, their faces immortalized in golden masks and colossal statues that gazed beyond the horizon. The Old Kingdom's pyramids had already touched the sky, but in the Bronze Age, Egypt reached its full radiance under dynasties that turned worship into statecraft. Temples lined the Nile from Memphis to Thebes, each stone laid in geometric perfection. each wall covered in hymns to gods who demanded balancement, the eternal truth. The river became Egypt's pulse, its floods dictating the rhythm of harvest and hunger, its waters carrying fleets of merchants and warriors. Bronze weapons glinted on the decks of ships bound for Byblos, Crete, and Punt, exchanging papyrus and linen for cedar, ivory, and myrrh. Yet, even in its splendor, Egypt's story was one of tension between divinity and decay. Pharaohs like Thutmose III and Ramses II expanded Egypt's reach, their armies thundering through Canaan and Syria, their victories immortalized in temple reliefs. But behind the triumphs lay a quieter struggle, the cost of eternal glory. The peasants who fed the empire labored under scorching suns, building monuments they would never see complete. The priests grew powerful, their gods demanding wealth that rivaled kings. In the shadow of every pyramid was the hum of inevitability, the knowledge that even divine kings bleed. And yet Egypt endured while others burned. Its writing hieroglyphs preserved its soul. Its art spoke of afterlives and endless dawns. Its bronzes gleamed not just as tools of war, but as symbols of eternity. The Nile carried its memory forward, even as the Bronze Age began to dim. For Egypt, time itself was the enemy, and the alliate never truly fell, only changed its shape, floating through the centuries like the eternal flow of the river that gave it life, across the deep blue of the Aegean, where the sunlight fractured on waves and salt hung heavy in the air. An island kingdom thrived in the quiet between storms. Crete, the cradle of the Minoans, was unlike any other power of the Bronze Age. There were no towering no endless deserts, no rivers of warrenly labyrinthine palaces, frescoes alive with color, and an ocean that whispered secrets from every shore. Knossos stood at its heart, a palace so vast and intricate that legends would later call it the labyrinth, home of the Minotaur. Its walls were painted with dolphins and dancers, bulls and gods. Its halls filled with light that danced across polished stone. The Minoans seemed to live in harmony with motion, the rhythm of trade, the tides, the festivals that bound them to the sea. They were sailors and artisans, their ships carrying olive oil, pottery, and bronze across the Aegean, linking Egypt, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia in silent networks of exchange. Their cities held no fortresses, as if they trusted the sea to guard them. Women appeared beside men in art and ceremony, their goddesses commanding as much reverence as any king. Yet beneath the beauty, there was uneasy fragility born of isolation and dependence. The sea that sustained them could also destroy. Around 1600 BCE, the island of Thera, now called Santorini, erupted with a fury unmatched for centuries. Ash blotted out the sky, waves rose higher than palaces, and the sun dimmed for years. The eruption tore apart the Aegean world, sending tsunamis that ravaged Crete's harbors and cloaked its fields in ash. The Minoan fleet, once the envy of the world, vanished beneath the sea. The survivors rebuilt, but the rhythm was broken. Soon, new warriors came from the mainland, the Mycenaeans bearing bronze swords and a hunger for empire. They took the palaces, the trade routes, and the myths. Yet even as their culture faded, the Minoans left something eternal, the dream of a world balanced between peace and power, beauty and fear. Their memory became legend, their ruins a whisper of Atlantis, their art a vision of what civilization could be before it learned the language of war. In their loss, the Aegean found its myth the story of a people who danced on the edge of paradise and fell into the sea. From the mainland hills of Greece came a harder breed of men, the Mycenaeans. They were not dreamers of peace like the Minoans. They were smiths of conquest, born beneath the clang of bronze and the scent of blood. Their citadels rose like clenched fists against the horizon. Mycenaean tyrants, palace, each one crowned with walls so massive later generations called them Cyclopean, as if only giants could have built them. At their gates stood lions, carved from stone, watching eternally over kings who believed themselves chosen by gods and fate. The Mycenaeans took what the Minoans had left behind and hardened it. Their palaces became fortresses, their ships war machines, their art blooded with scenes of battle and hunt. They learned writing from the Minoans, reshaping it into Linear B, the first Greek script, not for poetry but for record-keeping grain, armor, slaves, tribute. In their world, power was measured in bronze, blades, and buried treasure. Kings ruled as warlords, their thrones surrounded by mercenaries, their tombs filled with gold death masks that stared coldly into eternity. They built empires not through beauty but through fear, their armies sweeping across the Aegean and beyond. They conquered Crete, plundered Anatolia, and sent ships east toward Troy, a city whose smoke would rise into legend. The tales that would one day become Homer's Iliad were born in this age of heroes. Agamemnon, Achilles, Odysseus, names carved from the noise of steel on flesh. Yet behind the grandeur of bronze and glory, their civilization carried a shadow. Trade faltered, harvests waned, and their world so dependent on the networks of the sea grew brittle. Around 1200 BCE, catastrophe struck. The palaces burned, the kings vanished, the roads turned to dust. No one knows exactly why. Some speak of invasion, the sea peoples descending in waves. Others whisper of earthquakes, droughts, rebellion from within. Whatever the truth, the Mycenaeans fell like thunder fading over the horizon. The great citadel of Mycenae became silent, its lion gate staring into emptiness. The world plunged into darkness, the Bronze Age collapsing like a house of ash. But their echoes endured. In their ruins, Greece found the seeds of myth, the memory of kings and gods that would rise again centuries later. The Mycenaeans vanished. But they did not die. They became the ghosts that haunted every story of power, glory, and ruin ever told. Far from the Aegean storms, beyond mountains and deserts, another civilization stirred along the fertile veins of the Indus River. Here, where the monsoon rains kissed the plains of what is now Pakistan and northwest India, stood the Indus Valley. Civilization and empire without kings, without wars, without visible gods. Its cities Harappa, Mohenjo-Daros, from the dust-like living machines of precision and order. Streets ran in perfect grids, drains flowed beneath them like veins, and great baths glistened under the sun where thousands may have gathered in silent ritual. Every brick was measured, every line drawn with purpose, as if an unseen architect governed them all. There were no grand palaces, no sprawling temples to boast of divine rulers. Instead, there were warehouses, workshops, and quiet courtyards, where artisans molded clay seals marked with mysterious symbols, perhaps words, perhaps prayers etched into stone so small they could fit between 2 fingers. The people of the Indus worked with copper and bronze, shaping tools, ornaments, and the small figurines that watched over their homes. They traded far and wide up the Persian Gulf, across Mesopotamia, sending beads, textiles, and grain in exchange for tin, lapis lazuli, and the distant stories of other lands. Yet, for all their sophistication, the Indus left behind no record of their kings, no chronicles of conquest or faith. Only their stillness speaks, Some say they worshipped water, the giver and taker of life. Others see in their seals a pantheon of beasts and spirits, prototypes of gods who would one day rule Hindu temples. Their decline, like that of so many ancient worlds, came without warning. Around 1900 BCE, the cities began to empty. Wells dried, trade routes crumbled, and the great baths stood still beneath the weight of dust. Perhaps the rivers shifted. Perhaps invaders came from the north, or perhaps the land itself simply grew tired. When the last fires dimmed, the Indus people vanished into legend, leaving behind cities to advance for their time and a script no one has ever read. Today, Mohenjo-Daro still sleeps beneath the desert wind, ghost city of silence and symmetry, holding secrets older than most of the world's written history. And in that silence lies a whisper, a question that has followed humanity ever since. How can something so advanced, so perfectly ordered, simply disappear? Across continents, bronze became more than metal. It was a language of power, from the mountains of Afghanistan to the shores of the Mediterranean. Veins of copper and tin were pulled from the earth and carried along routes that tied distant worlds together in a web of glittering ambition. Caravans moved through deserts under the weight of raw ore, and ships carved their way through salt and storm, their cargoes clinking with the promise of wealth. The Bronze Age was the first great experiment in globalization, a network of trade, so vast it connected empires that would never see each other's faces. In the Near East, the city of Mari recorded letters written on clay tablets describing gifts of lapis from Afghanistan and tin from Anatolia. In Crete, Minoan merchants painted ships on their walls, sleek curved vessels slicing through blue waves toward Egypt. On the other side of the world, artisans in the Indus Valley shaped carnelian beads that would be found buried in Mesopotamian graves. Bronze itself was the thread that bound this world together. Yet its strength was also its weakness, for tin, the precious ingredient that gave bronze its edge, was rare. To make a sword or a plough required cooperation, long-distance trade, and delicate political balance. If a mine failed or a war cut off a caravan route, economies faltered. The kings of the Bronze Age ruled not just by might, but by connection. For power now depended on who controlled the flow of metal. Ships from Ugarit, Byblos, and Cyprus became the lifelines of empires, and every ingot carried across the sea became a token of fragile peace. Traders were the quiet kings of their agent-sung architects of civilization, moving from port to port with goods, stories, and rumors of distant lands. And always, in their wake, followed something darker. Pirates waited along the coastlines, hungry for gold and grain. Drought crept across the Levant, shaking kingdoms built on trade. The same routes that brought wealth could also bring ruin. Somewhere around 1200 BCE, that shimmering network began to fracture, like bronze cracking under too much strain. But before the collapse came the climax, a moment when the world hummed with the sound of commerce, the clatter of bronze, and the heartbeat of human ambition, believing the network would last forever. The end came quietly at first, like a slow tightening of breath before a scream. Around 1200 BCE, one by one, the great cities of the Bronze Age began to flicker out. Ugarit burned, its last messages clay tablets, pleading for aid found centuries later, still wet with desperation. Hattusa, the capital of the Hittites, was abandoned to silence. Mycenaean's walls cracked and fell. Egypt, though it survived, staggered beneath the weight of famine and invasion. No single event ended the Bronze Age. It was a storm made of many tempests colliding. Climate change shriveled harvests. Drought turned farmlands to dust, driving hungry people toward the coasts in search of food. Trade routes that once carried bronze and grain became battlefields. The sea peoples, mysterious raiders who appeared from the west, descended upon the Mediterranean like locusts, burning, pillaging, erasing. They left no clear origin, only destruction. To some, they were refugees of famine. To others, pirates born of chaos. What is certain is that they were both cause and symptom of the great unraveling. Without tin, bronze production halted. Without bronze, armies lost their blades, farmers their plows, and kings their crowns. The script itself began to vanish cuneiform, linear B, hieroglyphs all fading like languages of a dream. For centuries, humanity had built a glittering network of trade and technology. But it had grown too complex, too fragile, too dependent on balance. When one link broke, the chain collapsed. Across the lands that once rang with commerce and ceremony, darkness fell. Literacy disappeared. Cities emptied. Roads vanished under sand and time. Generations would pass before new powers rose from the ruins. In the ashes of this collapse, iron began to whisper its name. It was harder to forge, but more abundant, more democratic. The world that had lived by bronze would not return. And so ended the first great experiment of civilization, a lesson written not in ink or stone, but in ruin. Empires, no matter how radiant, live by connection and die by disconnection. The Bronze Age had reached too high, too fast, and the fall was not only material, but spiritual, a reminder that the strength of metal could not save a world that forgot how fragile it truly was. From the ruins of the Bronze Age came fire, and from fire came rebirth. The Iron Age began not with kings or temples, but with the hum of forges and the glow of molten ore. Iron was the people's metal common, stubborn and strong. It did not depend on distant mines or rare trade routes. It was everywhere, buried beneath the very feet of those who had lost everything. As blacksmiths learned to tame its temper, new societies rose from the bones of the old. In Greece, the city-states emerged: Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Akkad, of freedom and rivalry forged in the aftermath of collapse. In Mesopotamia, the Assyrians perfected war with iron blades, building an empire of fear and fire. In the Levant, the Phoenicians took to the sea, weaving a new web of trade with ships of cedar and sails of purple. The age of isolated kingdoms was over. The world was becoming interconnected again, but this time, not by fragile alliances of bronze, but by iron will and ambition. Iron changed everything: the tools of war, the tools of work, the tools of expansion. Agriculture flourished as stronger plows broke hard soil. Armies grew vast, disciplined, efficient. Cities fortified themselves with stone and steel. Knowledge, too, reignited. The alphabet, simpler than cuneiform, spread like a quiet revolution, allowing merchants, sailors, and commoners to read and write. Words became power once more. In the East, the Persians dreamed of unity, stretching their empire across 3 continents. In the West, Rome began as a small town of shepherds and thieves, destined to become a civilization of law, roads, and empire. Iron made conquest cheaper, but it also made resistance possible. Every sword forged in one land could be mirrored in another. And as empires grew, so did the idea of civilization itself, no longer confined to river valleys, but sprawling across continents, carried by language, belief, and trade. Yet within this resurgence, a darker echo remained. Every empire carried Within it the seed of its own ruin, for iron, though strong, still rusted. The world had learned to rebuild, but not to remember. The gods of bronze were gone, yet humanity's hunger to rise, to rule, to forget remained unchanged. Even now, as we look back across millennia, the Bronze Age still whispers through our modern world. Its echoes lie buried in our cities, in the shape of our tools, in the way we trade, and in the stories we tell. The first cities that rose along rivers taught us to gather, to build, to record time and memory. The first merchants who crossed deserts with metal and cloth taught us to connect, to depend, to trust, and to betray. The first kings who ruled from palaces of clay and gold taught us to dream of power and to fear its fall. When we speak of civilization, we are speaking of them, the architects of bronze, who forged order out of chaos and beauty from fire. Though the age itself ended in smoke and silence, its spirit never truly died. Every skyscraper reaching into the sky carries the ambition of Sumer. Every weapon, every plough, every circuit in the machines we build traces its ancestry to that first alloy born of copper and tin, joined by human curiosity. In the ruins of Mycenaean, in the lost halls of Hattusa, in the broken tablets of Ugarit, you can still feel it, the hum of a world that believed it had mastered nature, only to be reminded that it was still at her mercy. The gods may have changed their names, but the questions remain the same. What do we build, and why do we build it? How much power can a world bear before it shatters? The Bronze Age was both a dawn and a warning, a mirror, showing us our own reflection thousands of years before we were born. It began with discovery and ended with silence, and in that silence, humanity learned its most painful lesson, that no empire, no invention, no brilliance can escape time. Yet it is also a story of endurance, for even from its ashes rose new ages, new minds, new fires. So as you drift deeper into thought or sleep, remember that the world we know began not with iron or steam, but with the glow of bronze metal shaped by hands that believed in tomorrow, by hearts that sought eternity, and by civilizations that dared to dream that their light would never fade.